Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care.
The candles flickered low in the grand chamber, casting wavering shadows against the stone walls. The soft glow illuminated the rich tapestries that lined the room, depicting ancient battles and victories long forgotten. Outside, the wind howled gently, pushing against the heavy curtains. But inside, the oppressive silence wrapped around him like a shroud. Lord Aren sat alone at the edge of his vast bed, his broad shoulders hunched forward, hands resting on his knees. His dark hair, slightly disheveled, brushed against his forehead as he lowered his head in thought. The room, despite its luxury, felt cold, emptier than it had ever been. His estate, once filled with laughter and the hum of bustling life, now stood as a silent reminder of everything he'd lost. It had been months since the incident. The death of his beloved wife, the one light in his life, had extinguished all joy and warmth from his heart. Every corner of the estate whispered memories of her presence, and Aren had withdrawn, not just from the world, but from himself. Nights were the worst. Sleep eluded him, and the weight of his grief pressed harder with every passing hour. The loneliness was suffocating. That evening, there had been a knock on his door. He hadn't wanted to answer it, but duty compelled him. The arrival of the new maids, the latest addition to his household, had gone largely unnoticed by him. He had merely nodded as the steward introduced them, offering little more than a glance at the women before retreating back to the hollow sanctuary of his chambers. It was custom for nobility to receive maids from the outlying magical provinces, a mark of prestige. But Aren cared little for such things now. They were exquisite. He knew that much. Their beauty was undeniable, almost ethereal in its nature. Each had been chosen from distant lands where human blood rarely mingled, giving them an exotic appearance that made them seem more fantasy than flesh. The eldest, Delara, had an air of quiet confidence, her silver eyes never wavering. Ilara, the middle one, had a playful smirk hidden behind her deep green eyes, and the youngest, Lilith, was soft-spoken but with a curiosity that radiated from her delicate features. But to Aren, they were just another reminder of his responsibilities, a symbol of a life he no longer cared to maintain. He sighed deeply, his mind wandering back to the past. It was during moments like these, in the stillness of the night, that the memories came flooding back unbidden. Her laughter, her scent, her touch, all of it haunted him. His chest tightened, and he clenched his fists. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to feel anything but numbness. But tonight, for some reason, the weight of his emotions felt unbearable. Without thinking, he reached for the pendant that hung around his neck. It was hers, a simple piece of jewelry that she had worn every day. Holding it now brought a rush of memories. Memories that hurt far more than he was willing to admit. A single tear slipped down his cheek, though he quickly wiped it away, angry at himself for showing such weakness, even in solitude. That was when the door creaked open. Aren straightened, quickly composing himself, though he didn't turn to look. His voice was low, rough with exhaustion. "I thought I told you I wished to be left alone." The footsteps were soft, hesitant. He felt the presence of another in the room, and despite his protest, he sensed no immediate departure. Sighing, he turned his head slightly to see who had entered. It was Lilith, the youngest of the new alien maid. "My lord," she whispered, her voice soft and careful. "I apologize, but we heard you. The others, they thought you might be in need of company." Iren's brow furrowed. "I am in need of nothing," he said curtly, turning his gaze back to the floor. "Go back to your quarters." For a moment there was silence. He expected her to leave, but she did not. Instead, he felt her take a few steps closer, her voice barely above a breath. "We only wish to help, my lord." Aren exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling beneath his grief. "Help?" His voice came out harsher than he intended. "How can you possibly help?" Lilith hesitated, and then, to his surprise, she stepped forward until she stood beside him. She knelt quietly, her hands folded in front of her, and when she spoke again, her words were filled with more understanding than he thought possible. "I've seen your sadness, my lord," she whispered, "and I know what it is to grieve, but you do not have to carry it alone." Iren turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that night. There was something in her gaze, something unspoken. Her deep blue eyes shimmered with an otherworldly glow, a subtle indication of her magical lineage. But there was more than magic there. It was compassion, genuine and unforced. Iren started, but his voice failed him. He hadn't spoken about his pain to anyone, not even his closest advisors, and here was this young maid, offering a kind word in the dead of night. As he sat there, the room heavy with unspoken words, the door opened again. This time, the other two maids entered, just as quietly as Lilith had. Dilara, the eldest, closed the door behind them with a soft click, and Dilara approached with a gentle smile playing on her lips. "My lord," Dilara said, her tone calm and measured, "we did not wish to intrude, but you are not as alone as you think." Iren tensed, unsure of what to say or do. He had never been in such a situation. 3 women standing before him, their eyes filled with understanding, not judgment. He felt a strange stirring within him, something he had long buried beneath his grief and solitude. "You don't have to suffer in silence," Ilara said, her voice melodic as she took a seat at the edge of his bed. She was bold, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that was both comforting and intimate. "Let us take care of you." Iren's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't accustomed to such directness, especially from those who served him. His mind whirled with conflicting emotions, the loss, the sorrow, and the sudden surge of desire that had been locked away for so long. Lilith remained kneeling beside him, her presence comforting and warm, while Ilara's touch on his arm sent a tingle through his skin. Dilara, standing by the door, observed the scene with quiet authority, as though she was guiding the moment without a word. "You," Iren began, his voice strained, "shouldn't be here." His words were weak, lacking the conviction he intended. His heart hammered in his chest, betraying his true feelings. Dilara stepped forward, her silver eyes locking onto his with a steady, calming gaze. "My lord, we are here because you need us, even if you cannot admit it to yourself. We have seen your suffering. It is our duty to serve, but more than that, it is our choice to care for you." The way she spoke made it clear that this was not about mere servitude. There was something deeper in their actions, a desire to bring him solace, to offer comfort beyond what was expected of them. Iren had known these maids only briefly, but there was an unspoken bond forming between them that transcended the traditional relationship between master and servant. Iren's voice faltered as Ilara's hand moved up his arm, her fingers grazing the side of his neck. Her touch was soft, almost teasing, but there was a firmness in her approach that made his pulse quicken. His body reacted instinctively, despite the internal battle raging in his mind. Ilara leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "You've carried this burden alone for far too long," she whispered. "Let us help you. Let us bring you peace." Iren closed his eyes, torn between the need to push them away and the deep, gnawing desire to surrender to the comfort they were offering. His muscles tensed, but the weight of his grief, the constant tension he held in his body, began to release. For so long, he had built walls around his heart, keeping everyone at arm's length, afraid to feel again. Now, in the quiet of the night, those walls were beginning to crack. Lilith, still kneeling beside him, reached out and gently took his hand in hers. Her touch was delicate, her fingers cool against his skin, yet it brought with it a warmth that seeped into him, soothing the raw ache inside. She looked up at him, her deep blue eyes filled with empathy. "You don't have to be strong all the time, my lord." Iren's breath shuddered as he exhaled. He opened his eyes and looked down at Lilith, who was watching him with such gentleness. It nearly undid him. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was the kindness in her eyes that struck him the most. He had never allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of anyone since the death of his wife, but now, in the presence of these 3 women, he felt that vulnerability rising to the surface. Dilara approached him slowly, her movements graceful and precise, like a dancer gliding across the floor. She knelt beside Lilith, her silver eyes never leaving his. "Let us in, my lord," she said softly. "You need not carry this alone." Irend swallowed hard, his chest tightening as the weight of his emotions pressed against him. His hand tightened around the pendant at his neck, the last physical reminder of his wife. He felt the familiar sting of grief, but now it was joined by something else, something new and unexpected. Desire. It had been so long since he had felt anything beyond sorrow, but now, with these three women surrounding him, offering themselves not only as caretakers, but as something more, the long-dormant fire inside him began to flicker back to life. It was not just a physical desire. It was the need for connection, the yearning to feel alive again. Ilara's hand slid down his chest, her touch igniting a slow burn inside him. Her lips brushed against his ear, and she whispered, "Let us take away your pain, my lord." His resolve crumbled. With a soft groan, Irend let go of the pendant and turned toward Ilara. Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she leaned in, her lips capturing his in a kiss that was both tender and insistent. It was as if a dam had broken inside him. The flood of emotions he had kept bottled up for so long spilled out, and he kissed her back, his hands gripping her waist as he pulled her closer. Delara and Lilith watched, their eyes filled with approval as they remained close, their presence a comforting reminder that he was not alone. Irend broke the kiss with Ilara and turned to face Lilith. She blushed, her lips parted as she gazed up at him with wide, eager eyes. Gently, Irend cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing across her cheek. Her skin was smooth, almost luminescent in the dim light. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as if she had been waiting for this moment. He bent down and pressed his lips to hers, the kiss soft and sweet. Lilith responded with a shy but growing intensity, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as she kissed him back. Delara moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder, her touch both grounding and intimate. "You deserve this, my lord," she murmured. "You've suffered long enough." Irend felt their warmth surrounding him, the three of them working in unison to bring him pleasure, to soothe the ache inside him. It wasn't just about lust, it was about healing, about filling the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. Lilith's kiss deepened, her shyness giving way to passion as she pressed her body against his. Ilara's hands roamed across his chest, her fingers deftly unbuttoning his shirt, while Delara's voice, calm and soothing, guided them through the intimate encounter. For the first time in months, Irend allowed himself to feel, really feel. The grief that had weighed him down began to lift, replaced by the warmth and comfort of the women who surrounded him. The night stretched on, their shared intimacy healing the deep wounds that had festered in his heart. When it was over, Irend lay in the center of the bed, the three maids curled up beside him, their bodies entwined with his. His heart, which had felt so cold and distant for so long, was now full. The ache of his loss was still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. Instead, it was joined by a sense of peace, of connection, and perhaps even hope for the future. As he drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the warmth of his new companions, Irend realized that he was no longer alone. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive. The night wore on, and though the flicker of candlelight dimmed, the warmth in the room grew. Irend lay still for a moment, his breathing even but his mind whirling with the events that had just unfolded. His body was still humming with the sensations that the maids had stirred within him, a deep sense of fulfillment resting beneath the surface of his once broken heart. Lilith lay beside him, her soft body pressed close to his. Her head rested gently against his chest, the faint rise and fall of her breath matching the rhythm of his own. She looked peaceful, almost fragile, and yet he knew that there was a strength in her that had helped him break down the walls he'd built around himself. On his other side, Ilara was more brazen. She toyed idly with his hair, her playful smile barely concealed as she traced her fingers across his scalp, sending shivers down his spine. There was something mischievous in her demeanor, as though she relished in being the one who had drawn him out of his shell, who had coaxed him into surrendering to his deepest desires. And then there was Delara, the eldest of the alien maids. She sat at the edge of the bed, her silver eyes watching him with calm understanding. She had played the role of the guide, the one who had overseen the encounter with a measured hand, ensuring that it remained not just an indulgence, but a shared experience of healing. Iren turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Delara's. There was something unsaid between them, a silent recognition of what had just passed. She had not been as forward as the others, but her presence had been felt all the same, steady and strong, like a foundation that kept the night from spiraling into mere lust. Her hands had touched him as well. Her lips had brushed against his. But there had been something more in her actions, a sense of control, of purpose. "Why?" Iren asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. Delara's silver eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking. "Because you needed it," she replied simply. Iren swallowed, his throat tight. He had never been one to seek comfort from others, even before the tragedy that had befallen him. His strength had always come from within, from the discipline he had cultivated as a leader, as a warrior. But now, in the stillness of the night, with the soft bodies of the maids pressed against him, he realized that perhaps strength also came from allowing oneself to be vulnerable. Lilith stirred beside him, her delicate fingers tracing idle patterns across his chest. "You don't have to be alone anymore, my lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the backdrop of the quiet room. Her words struck something deep inside him. For months, he had carried the weight of his grief alone, refusing to let anyone in, afraid that doing so would diminish the memory of his wife. But now, with the presence of these women, he realized that moving forward did not mean forgetting. It meant allowing himself to heal. He began, his voice faltering. "I don't know how to move on." Delara, ever the guide, leaned forward, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "It's not about forgetting," she said softly. "It's about living again. Your grief is a part of you, but it does not have to define you. We are here to help you remember what it feels like to live." Delara chuckled softly from beside him, her fingers continuing their playful dance through his hair. "And to remind you that life is meant to be enjoyed, my lord," she teased, her lips brushing against his ear in a way that sent another shiver down his spine. Iren smiled despite himself. He hadn't smiled in so long that the feeling was foreign, but welcome. He turned to Alara, his hand reaching up to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You're bold," he remarked, his tone light. She grinned, her emerald eyes sparkling. "Boldness is rewarded, is it not?" Lilith, ever the gentle one, pressed herself closer to him, her head nestled against the crook of his neck. "You deserve happiness, my lord," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Iren's heart tightened at her words, the tenderness in her voice, the sincerity in her eyes. It all felt so foreign, yet it was exactly what he needed. His hand rested on her back, pulling her closer as he let out a soft sigh. "Perhaps you're right," he admitted quietly. Delara stood then, her presence commanding attention despite her calm demeanor. She moved toward the large window that overlooked the vast estate, pulling the curtains aside just enough to reveal the soft glow of the moonlight outside. "You are lord of this house, of this land," she said, her voice steady. "But that does not mean you must be a prisoner to your own sorrow. The night is long, but it will pass, and when it does, you will be stronger for having allowed yourself to feel again." Iren watched her, her figure bathed in the soft silver light of the moon. There was wisdom in her words, a wisdom he had been too blind to see before. For so long, he had believed that strength meant holding everything inside, bearing the weight of his sorrow in silence. But now, surrounded by these women who had seen him at his most vulnerable and still stood by him, he realized that perhaps true strength came from allowing others to help carry the burden. Lilith's soft lips pressed a kiss to his chest, drawing his attention back to the present. Alara's playful fingers twirled a lock of his hair, and Delara, standing by the window, offered him a knowing smile. "I won't forget," Iren whispered, his voice barely audible, but firm. "But I will live again." Delara's smile widened, and she nodded approvingly. "Good," she said softly. "That's all we ask." The room fell silent once more, but this time, it was a comfortable silence, filled with the warmth of shared understanding. The night was still young, and though the weight of the past still lingered, it no longer felt so heavy. Iren closed his eyes, the warmth of the maids' bodies against his own offering him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. As sleep began to take hold, he realized that he was no longer alone. Not truly. He had found companionship in the most unexpected of places, and though the journey ahead was still uncertain, he knew that with these women by his side, he would face it with renewed strength. The night stretched on, the stillness in the room interrupted only by the quiet breathing of those within. As Iren drifted in and out of sleep, his mind turned over the events of the evening, struggling to fully grasp the transformation that had taken place. He had expected nothing from this night but more solitude. Yet here he was, surrounded by warmth and connection he had long thought impossible to reclaim. His dreams were different that night, no longer haunted by the painful memories that had plagued him for so long. Instead, they were filled with images of renewal. He stood on the edge of a vast forest, the sun breaking through the thick canopy of trees, its light spilling over the path ahead. The dense fog of grief that had clouded his vision for months seemed to have lifted, allowing him to see clearly once more. And there, in the clearing, stood the three women, his maids, his companions, beckoning him forward with smiles that promised new beginnings. But it wasn't just a dream. It was a reflection of what was happening within him. For the first time, he could feel the shift in his heart, a crack in the walls he had built. It was as if the weight of his sorrow had finally begun to lift, and in its place, a new purpose began to form. When morning finally came, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, casting a soft, golden light across the room. Iren stirred, blinking slowly as his eyes adjusted to the light. The warmth of Lilith's body was still pressed against him, her soft breathing steady and calm. Ilara had shifted in the night, now lying with her head resting against his shoulder, her fingers still loosely tangled in his hair. Delara, ever watchful, sat near the window, her gaze focused on the horizon as the sun rose. It was a sight that Iren would never forget. Slowly, he sat up, careful not to disturb the women beside him. He felt a strange lightness in his chest, as though the oppressive weight he had carried for so long had finally been lifted. His body still ached with the remnants of his grief, but it no longer consumed him. He was no longer defined by it. As he looked down at Lilith, her peaceful face bathed in the morning light, he felt a surge of affection. She had been the one to approach him first, the one who had sensed his need for comfort even when he had been too stubborn to admit it. Her kindness had been the key to unlocking the emotions he had buried for so long. Ilara stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. She stretched lazily, a contented smile playing on her lips as she looked up at him. "Good morning, my lord," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "Did you rest well?" Iren nodded, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair away from her face. "I did," he admitted, for the first time in a long while. Delara rose from her seat by the window and crossed the room with her usual grace. She stopped beside the bed, her silver eyes meeting his with quiet approval. "The night has passed," she said softly, her voice steady and calm, "and with it your burden has lessened." Iren looked up at her, a deep sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. "You've all done more for me than I could have ever imagined," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Delara shook her head, a soft smile curving her lips. "There is no debt, my lord," she said. "We are here because we chose to be, and we will remain by your side for as long as you need us." Ilara, ever playful, sat up and rested her chin on his shoulder, her arms wrapping around him from behind. "Besides," she purred, "it was our pleasure." Iren chuckled softly, the sound foreign yet welcome. It felt good to laugh, to feel light again. He reached up and gently squeezed Delara's hand before turning his gaze back to Delara. "What now?" he asked, his voice quiet, but no longer heavy with despair. Delara's eyes shimmered in the morning light as she spoke. "Now you live. You step forward, and you embrace the future." Iren nodded, the words settling deep within him. It was time to live again. He had spent too long hiding from the world, from himself. The pain of his past would always remain, but it would no longer dictate his life. With a deep breath, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood. The cool morning air kissed his skin, and for the first time in what felt like years, he felt truly alive. The weight of his responsibilities as lord of the estate still loomed large, but now they no longer seemed so overwhelming. He would face them, with these women by his side. The three maids rose with him, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder that he was no longer alone. Lilith's shy smile, Alara's playful smirk, and Delara's steady gaze. All of them gave him the strength he needed to move forward. "Let's go," Iren said, his voice firm, yet soft. "It's time to face the day." The maids followed him as he stepped toward the window, where the sun was now fully risen, bathing the land in golden light. The vast expanse of his estate stretched out before him, a reminder of the life that awaited him beyond the walls of his chamber. For the first time since his wife's death, Iren felt a glimmer of hope. The grief would never fully leave him, but he had learned that it did not need to consume him. He had found comfort, companionship, and perhaps even love in the most unexpected of places. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next. As the sun continued its ascent into the sky, Iren turned to his maids, his companions, his friends. He smiled, a real, genuine smile, and they smiled back, their eyes filled with warmth and understanding. Together, they stepped forward into the light, ready to face the future, whatever it might bring.